Hey guys, welcome to your last lesson of your semester in ecology. Thanks so much for taking this journey with me so far. This lesson is essentially meant to be the bookends around all of the content that we've discussed so far. So all of the the food webs and the competition and how populations are growing or shrinking. So all of that stuff, what's happening on either side of it. So essentially, decomposition and nutrient cycling. So where are the nutrients coming from um, to actually get into the food web and uh, sustain all of the organisms within it, the entire community, and all the way on the other end, what is happening in the landscape. So multiple kind of smaller ecosystems joining together to form a landscape mosaic. So let's begin with talking about nutrient cycling. This is a concept that you've probably been exposed to at some point before in your educational career, but just as a review or maybe a first introduction, um, nutrients, so things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, these things will uh, ultimately enter into the food chain, enter into the biotic component of the ecosystem through plants, right? Through photosynthesizers. Plants first take these nutrients, and in this lesson, I'm just going to talk about nitrogen, but we could talk about a variety of different cycles. Um, Plants take in nitrogen as either ammonium or nitrate. And all plants can take both in, but essentially, depending on the pH of the soil and the adaptations of the plant, there's kind of a preference for one, ammonium or nitrate. And so we can see here is our primary producer, our plant is taking up or assimilating nitrogen in the form of nitrate, right? Mostly nitrate, but also in the form of ammonium. This nitrogen is going to be critical in the plant's just day-to-day function. So in creating these nitrogen-based compounds, such as proteins and nucleic acids, without nitrogen, the plant cannot grow. It cannot sustain its everyday functions. Uh, so uh, the nitrogen availability, therefore, in the soil, and specifically in these two forms, ammonium and nitrate, that is going to limit the rate of uptake into the plant and therefore limit the rate of plant growth, plant photosynthesis, plant excretion of oxygen and water. So all of these things are limited by the availability of nitrogen, specifically in these two forms. And so a lot of times when you buy fertilizer, there will be a couple different numbers on the front. Those numbers represent how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are in the fertilizer. And the fact that we need fertilizer, need this supplemental addition of nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, indicates the importance of these nutrients to the plant. Again, nitrogen really being one of the main limiting factors in plant growth. And of course, that exerts this bottom-up effect on the rest of the community. If plant growth is limited, that's going to limit the growth of all of the other organisms that depend on that. So again, nitrogen availability in the soil is going to affect the rate of photosynthesis, which affects what we can collectively call the net primary productivity, or the NPP. This is the rate at which an ecosystem accumulates energy or biomass, right? So more growth with more nitrogen. And so the limiting step to producing NPP, net primary productivity, all of the biomass, all of the plants and animals and fungi and all of the organisms in the ecosystem is limited by how much nitrogen is available for plants. And so as we can see, nitrate and ammonium aren't necessarily directly excreted by other organisms within the food chain, right? So we think of the circle of life, and animals and other organisms that are decomposing don't, release nitrogen in the form that is actually accessible, that is able to be assimilated by the plants. And so nitrogen actually needs to be processed, it needs to be modified into a biologically active compound. And so there are a couple different ways that nitrogen can be can be processed into a form that plants can use, and therefore give rise to a larger NPP. One of those ways is the very abundant nitrogen in the atmosphere. About 80% of the air we breathe is actually nitrogen. And so this nitrogen, unfortunately, cannot be used directly by plants. And so it has to actually be what's called fixed by a variety of organisms. Earlier this semester, recently, but earlier, we talked about nitrogen fixing bacteria, how some plants actually invite in a um, a species of bacteria that fixes nitrogen. That is, it takes this N2 from the atmosphere and converts it into NH3, ammonia, which of course then can be converted into something else that plants can use. So, of course, we know from our previous discussions that this mutualistic symbiotic relationship with the plant helps the bacteria because it's a nice cushy place to live. It might be getting some carbon from the plant, and in exchange the plant has a ready source of fixed nitrogen, so actually usable nitrogen. Another source of nitrogen in addition to the atmosphere is decomposition. Of course, plant tissues senesce, right? So this tree will lose its leaves as it approaches winter. All organisms die, and so those tissues begin to decompose, right? And all of the molecules within them break down into other forms, and ultimately through that decomposition process, nitrogen is returned to the soil. And so here we can see the decomposers are converting tissues within the animal and in the plants into this usable form, ammonia. Okay, so as we can see, nitrogen is assimilated into plants, and that kind of allows all other organisms within the community to grow, to produce this NPP. When those organisms die, or when they lose tissues, when they even defecate, those molecules can be ammonified, they can be nitrified, and ultimately, once again, assimilated back into plants. There is a small amount of atmospheric nitrogen that can also be fixed by lightning, but the consistent, dependable way of kind of completing this cycle is through bacteria. So decomposition, as we can see in that nitrogen cycle, is critical to, again, completing the cycle, to taking nitrogen, which has already been in organisms' tissues, and allowing it to jump back into the food web at the bottom in the plants and the primary producers. So decomposition essentially is breaking these chemical bonds that were in organic molecules that are in your tissues, and the tissues of all of the community. So decomposition releases energy that was originally fixed by photosynthesis. We know that photosynthesis produces sugar, given the energy of the sun. And of course, within these sugar molecules, so within glucose, within fructose, etc., energy is, of course, stored within those bonds. Energy, which, of course, when we eat those sugars, is released via a very complex process that I'm sure you know all the details of, through cellular respiration, right? So energy comes in, glucose comes in, and through a series of enzymatic reactions in the mitochondria and out in the cytoplasm, ATP, another energy storage molecule, is produced, and in as kind of byproducts, carbon dioxide and water are released. Okay, so again, decomposition is breaking down these molecules that were originally generated by photosynthesis, and other reactions in the body. So this here is a protein. So taking these larger molecules, breaking them into smaller molecules, releasing energy in the process, and of course, making smaller molecules. Decomposers and detritivores, we've talked about a little bit earlier this term. Decomposers and detritivores are organisms whose job is to break down these larger molecules to feed on specifically dead organic matter, also called detritus. We have invertebrate detritivores that fragment detritus, so leaf litter, for example, and they chop it up into smaller pieces and ultimately break it down into these smaller molecules. And so there isn't just one class of decomposers or detritivores. Essentially, there are many different organisms. The first ones will break down the larger leaves. The next ones will break down, essentially the fragments that were produced by the original detritivores, and so on and so forth. And so essentially, the decomposition process ultimately involves yet another succession. Right, so from one microbe to the next until finally all of the organic material is mineralized and therefore able to be assimilated back into plants. To some degree, heterotrophs, so organisms like us, are decomposers. Yes, that is true. Like we eat sugar, sucrose, sugar, we eat proteins, and we are actually digesting these molecules into smaller and smaller molecules. So yes, we do some decomposition to a degree, but no, we are not considered to be true detritivores. Right? We are not going around munching on, logs in the forest. Okay. And so just a very brief aside, when I am not teaching ecology and other things that I teach at Stockton, I am being an organic farmer. And so I have designed my farming practices to kind of mimic these successional stages, to mimic these cycles of nature. And so I just wanted to very briefly point out what I do, because I think it's kind of cool and kind of a way that I can take all of these ecological principles and apply them to land management. And of course, as a nice bonus, I can help to feed the community with non-chemical laden food, which is really cool to me. I have multiple types of animals, right? So pigs, chickens, turkeys, and of course, our friendly neighborhood peacock. And so in my kind of crop rotation, so like simulated successional stages, essentially we first grow grass. Once the grass is kind of established, we take our little chicken coops here, which are chicken tractors. The floor is open and the chickens kind of eat the grass, they eat the insects, they eat all sorts of things within that little 8x8 section. And then every day at the end of the day, we move these up one more space. And so essentially the chickens are being the primary consumers. They are ingesting the products of photosynthesis, the grass, etc. And so after, the chickens go through, and we can see from this aerial, Google Maps image here, each of the little boxes here, these were where all the pens were previously, right? We can see that the chickens are, yes, they are eating the grass, but at the same time, they are really fertilizing the grass as well. So adding a ton of nitrogen back into the soil. And so, each box is where the chickens were, and they were fertilizing. They were, kind of completing this nitrogen cycle. And around each of the boxes, the grass is not quite so green. So here, not quite so green. Oh yeah, here, certainly not so green. And so we can really see the effects of, the chickens, and they're fertilizing the grass where they just were. Of course, to continue completing this cycle, we do send pigs through at a certain point, or have in the past sent pigs through. And pigs are great at just kind of like disturbing the soil. They will dig down under the grass, they will turn it up, they will eat any kind of grubs or whatever that are in the soil. And of course, we give them fresh produce as well to kind of supplement that. And so this disturbs the soil enough, we can replant grasses or allow seeds that were already in the soil to grow in its place, therefore acting as a disturbance to bring this, or kind of like rewind the successional clock, go back to an earlier cereal stage, and then start growing up again. Um, and so in this way, we get all sorts of products that, of course, we can sell to the community, eggs and meat, and we actually harvest the grass as well as hay. So definitely, again, mimicking the cycles of nature that would be happening naturally, but we're doing it agriculturally. And this image right here, the wild turkeys just love hanging out with our chickens and turkeys as well. So an understanding of decomposition and the cyclical nature of nutrient transfer within the ecosystem is really important, of course, to farmers, so in agriculture, but ecologists also have recognized the value of studying decomposition in understanding that really this is the base of the food chain. What is decomposing is directly going to impact NPP in the future. And so ecologists study the process of decomposition in many different ways, but I'm going to show you two here. In the terrestrial ecosystem, ecologists can add a certain or a known mass of leaf litter, for example, right? So this is some of that biomass that is breaking down. Okay, so adding plant litter into these synthetic non-biodegradable bags, you know exactly how much is going in. You wait a season or a month or however long, and essentially come back, measure how much is left over. Usually this involves drying it out, right? So, not including any of the water mass, just the leaf litter itself. And so that tells you how much of this plant matter has actually been decomposed and therefore returned to the soil. In riparian ecosystems, similar idea. Instead of these litter bags, there are leaf packs. And so essentially, if we zoom into this ecosystem here, what we can see is a lot of leaves essentially end up in the water. And this is an extremely important food source for all of the macroinvertebrates. They're kind of the first organisms that start breaking down this leaf litter and returning the nutrients into the water and then ultimately into the plants. And so these leaf packs, they can accumulate however much leaf litter is in the water, right? So here we can see, these leaf packs, they are actually catching the leaves. They are not, they're not provided with the leaves. They are catching whatever is falling into the water. The mesh bags stay suspended in the water, and so macroinvertebrates can, enter in through these holes, chop up the leaves, and then, we can measure essentially how much mass has been lost. Okay? So kind of similar ideas in both types of ecosystems. So again, ecologists study kind of the base of the food web, what is happening in decomposition, and we can also kind of zoom way out to study the entire landscape. So understanding how many nutrients are going in, we can study every level going up the chain, what is happening within individual organisms, within populations, within the communities, within the entire ecosystem. And if we zoom all the way out from there, we can talk about the landscape. So multiple ecosystems within the larger land. Landscape ecology focuses for the most part on heterogeneity. So essentially, multiple ecosystems. Here we can see in an agricultural environment, many different ecosystems essentially based on what type of crop is growing, but we can also do this in the forest. So here on this mountain range, we see multiple types of forest, right? So, this heavily forested, this is kind of earlier in succession. There was some kind of disturbance. Also, it is on the other side of the slope, and so it has a different microclimate, as we talked about earlier. We can also see that there has been some logging in this area, and so the heterogeneity is really what is being studied by landscape ecologists. Okay. These different ecosystems can, of course, be human generated. They can be anthropogenic, such as in both of these examples, but they can also be naturally as well, naturally generated. Um, and so if we look at this entire landscape, we see that there are essentially these patches of different ecosystems, of different land uses. Um, and so we can call, uh, or we can appreciate that this habitat um, is not homogeneous and it's not the same type of habitat throughout. Instead, it's kind of fragmented. And so habitat fragmentation is this division of larger tracts of habitat, like one specific type of forest or land use that has patches of different types of land uses in between. And so in this example from your book, we can see this dotted line. Same land studied in all of these different images from the 1750s all the way until the 1970s. Here, what we can see in the 1750s is these very large blocks, 10 of them, of forest. But as time goes on, we see that the tracts of forests are cut up more and more. So you can imagine there are housing developments, there are factories, there are whatever going in between these forest patches. By the 1930s, very small patches. And by the time you get to the 1970s, what was 10 large blocks is now over 1,000 tiny patches that are less than 1 hectare each. And so organisms living within this land are going to, of course, be affected by the fact that there is not a large forest anymore, just many small fragments instead. And so just for some terminology here, patches are roughly homogeneous compared to the larger areas that surround them. So this one green patch right here is like one patch of forest. These tiny little guys here are also patches, right? So different compared to what is surrounding them. Each of these patches is surrounded, of course, by a boundary. So the boundary in between the patch and the surrounding ecosystem. So it's where it meets the other patch. And as we're going to see in future slides, these boundary areas are very important for a variety of organisms. And in some instances, there can be corridors connecting adjacent patches. And so this is essentially an extension of one patch, creating a path for organisms to migrate from one into the next. And so again, boundaries, the edges of these patches are very important because the conditions in a patch is very different than either in the patch or outside of the patch. So very unique environment. These patches essentially offer a gradient of conditions, such as wind flow, moisture, temperature, etc. So you can imagine that, look up here, really sunny, maybe hot, maybe drier out here. In the patch, nice and shaded, so cooler, maybe moister. But in between, there is, it's not as hot, it's not as dry. There might be a lot more wind on the edge of the patch as opposed to within the forest, but not quite so much as way out here in the field. And so the boundaries offer different conditions, right? And therefore they are available to serve as habitat for different organisms, of course, with a different zone of tolerance. Okay. We can see that there are different types of boundaries. A sharp, high contrast boundary here, essentially very, very different conditions, an abrupt stop, and then the other type of condition in here. Some boundaries have a little bit more of a transition. All right, so here we can see that there are intermediately sized shrubs between this grassland and this forest. And here we can see some shrubs, some shorter trees, and then finally kind of transitioning much more slowly into the forest environment. And even some of these shrubs entering into the forest as well. So this, the border, the boundaries, provides very different characteristics. Also, we can see that boundaries restrict or facilitate the dispersal of seeds, just like we talked about with Mount St. Helens. We had these refugias, these patches that weren't actually covered by lava and ash. And so that essentially was one tiny little patch with a boundary. And we talked about how animals, birds, for example, can fly into the patch, into their refuge, into this, take seeds, and then distribute them around the patch, therefore expanding the patch ultimately. And so boundaries, depending on the structure of them, can again restrict or facilitate. Many birds love to live in, this kind of shrubby type typed plants, which are very commonly found on borders between a patch and the open land. And so, this provides a lot of shelter. It's really hard for hawks and other predators to get into something so shrubby like this. So birds love to hang out here, but they can very quickly and easily, go from here out, forage out here in the grassland and then back. They can forage over here in the forest, picking up seeds, defecate out here, and so on and so forth. So these types of kind of gradual transitions are very important in expanding the patch. There are certain species of, birds are frequently my examples here, but many species of birds and other animals that are restricted to edge environments. So this here, for example, indigo buntings, which are present in South Jersey. Indigo buntings live in these types of kind of shrubby, much more protected plants. They forage out here in the field, return to the woods, and they can forage in the woods and come back here. But essentially, they are always going back to their home base right there on the edge. And so these animals and many others are adapted to the edge environment, not to the forest, not to the field, but right in the middle. The edge effect. Again, these boundaries offer access to different types of communities. They are immediately adjacent to one another. And of course, some species are adapted to only live on these edges, only on the boundaries here. Also, this boundary abuts forest and field, for example. There are species adapted to the forest, there are species adapted to the field, and then, of course, to the edge in between. And so these edges of, this nice smooth gradient of climatic conditions, they actually sustain the largest biodiversity. And so what we can see in this graph here is the distance from the edge, right? So the forest would be over here, and the distance from the boundary farther and farther out into the field, for example. What we can see here is there are many edge species that only are, hanging out by this edge. So many edge species here, they become less and less frequent as you get farther and farther from the edge, as you might imagine. Deep forest species, of course, get more abundant as you move into the forest, right? And there are many species that don't really care, right? So they can go into the forest, they can go into the field, they can hang out on the edge, doesn't matter, they're good to go with whatever. And so those species are hanging out by the edge as well. And so if you add up all of the species, forest, edge, and unaffected species, we see that the most diversity is closest to the edge. And it kind of tapers out as you get farther from the edge and into the forest. Okay, this edge effect is essentially, the benefit of the edge, these different community types, these different climates being right next to each other. And the greater the contrast, the greater the species diversity. Um, Another term for you guys, interior species. These guys require conditions found only in the interior habitat. So these would be essentially your deep forest species here. They avoid the boundary environments and require a much deeper protected area. Right, so this is not advocating for only edges. We need lots of edges, like nice wavy boundaries to increase the area of the edge. Instead, this is a story in diversity of landscapes to promote the most species. Okay, so interior species, again, they require a significant buffer from the edge in order to survive. Okay. Okay, so patch size in that way is going to influence the effect of the edge versus the interior habitats. So essentially, small patches are more or less going to be all edge. Okay? So you get larger patches. We see the same edge, right? The same area of edge, but now way inside the patch, we can see essentially that this area is protected from the edge. A larger patch is going to have a much larger area that is essentially the interior, the protected area. It is not the edge. And therefore it can sustain some of these interior species. And so what we can see here, again, the abundance of these animals, and here is the area of the forest. So larger patch, smaller patches. Edge species are much more abundant when the patches are smaller. It's things like this catbird here. Interior species, they can only live away from the edge, so they need to be protected. So certain warblers, ovenbirds, actually common in South Jersey when the patches are big enough. Okay? So ovenbirds, for example, they need to be very protected because essentially they kind of like burrow under the leaf litter and like form this little cave under the leaf litter, which looks like they're like peeking out through a little oven, which is why they're called ovenbirds. And so if they were just like on the edge of a parking lot, they would surely get predated upon, they would get stepped on. So they need the protection of the larger forest. Essentially, in order to support organisms that require interior spaces, you need to have a patch that's large enough and essentially round enough to have to develop interior conditions. So as we can see here, this might have a lot of area, right? So a relatively large patch, but the fact that it's so skinny means that essentially the entire patch is acting as edge. So this would not sustain an ovenbird. This patch, on the other hand, is round enough, right? So it's large enough, it's not super skinny, that it actually develops this core area. So the number of species is usually positively correlated with the habitat patch or size, and as we can see also with the patch shape. Larger habitats, or essentially these islands, have more niches, they have interior and edge habitat, and therefore they can support a larger abundance of organisms. As opposed to smaller habitats, so this tiny little patch right here, it has fewer niches, fewer opportunities for organisms to establish themselves, and there's going to be a ton of competition for the very limited resources. And so smaller habitats, smaller patches support many fewer organisms. In addition to the size, habitat isolation is another important factor in determining essentially the species diversity, as well as abundance within these patches. So isolation is essentially how far are these patches away from each other. Okay, so the farther away they are, the more difficult it's going to be for organisms to pass from one patch to the next, and therefore you get less migration and fewer species able to colonize. And so maybe this is something you're familiar with from your introductory biology class, but this theory of island biogeography. states that essentially species richness depends on the island size and on its isolation. And so we can think about these patches as essentially being islands, right, surrounded by water, or in this case, surrounded by agriculture. The closer an island is, or a patch is, to a larger habitat, so in this case, the mainland, the continent, here, like maybe this is a large one and these are isolated from it. The closer the patch is to a larger ecosystem of that type, the more migration, the more immigration is going to happen to that patch. Okay, here we can see the remoteness of the island. Near shore or near another patch versus more remote, so way out here. And so near shore or near another patch, islands are going to have a higher rate of immigration and a lower rate of extinction, right? So here we can see near shore has a lower rate of extinction and a higher rate of immigration. And so if we consider new migrants and extinction events, the number of species on the island is going to be much greater when an island is near another island versus when it is farther away from another island. Okay, so having patches that are really close together is important in species diversity. Okay. Similarly, the island size, as we've been talking about, larger islands, larger patches are going to attract more immigrants, and they're going to have a lower extinction rate. And so if we look down here to the number of species on the island, large islands or patches in the terrestrial environment have many more, or have more species than small islands do. And so what does this mean for land management? So the protection of adjacent landscapes is really important in promoting the largest species diversity, the largest species richness. This image here is from the Four Corners region, so Arizona, Utah, Colorado. All of these green patches here are national forests. And so what we can see here is that these national forests, instead of being kind of spread out all over the states, for the most part, land managers or people who are organizations maybe that are choosing what land to preserve versus what land not to preserve, they can selectively group all of the protected areas together, therefore creating a much larger patch. So if we look closely, we can see that there are lines here separating the different national forests. But if you ignore those lines, we see that this patch is actually very large, like going through most of the state of Colorado. Right? As opposed to, the Kaibab National Forest is relatively isolated from other patches, from other protected areas. Of course, in reality, the Kaibab is right next to the Grand Canyon National Park. So when national parks are considered, there is an even larger patch. Okay, so land managers seek corridors or, grouping these protected lands together to increase the size of the patch, creating a lot of interior space for animals that require an interior space, as well as a lot of edge for animals that like the edge. When there are patches that are not connected, managers can develop what are called green corridors. So this is an image in Guinea. Here is a patch, here is a patch. Here, chimpanzees require a lot of interior space. And so this smaller patch here is not able to sustain a large population of chimpanzees. And so i- these managers have developed what's called a green corridor, essentially like a little pathway through um, through this other land type, allowing the chimpanzees to go from the smaller patch to the larger patch and back again. So this is also forested and able to, um, you know, allow immigration from one patch to the next. Many patches are divided by some pretty dangerous environments that inhibit migration. So here we can see amphibians, maybe reptiles, very small vertebrates crossing the road, right? So a road here might not seem like a big deal for a deer that can just hop over it in 2 seconds, but for smaller animals, this road creates quite a big barrier to immigrating from one patch to the next patch. And of course, during the reproductive season, there are many young amphibians and reptiles that need to cross the road from one patch to the next, especially if, breeding grounds on one side of the road and habitat on the other side of the road. And so there are actually volunteer projects where people actually go out at night and they like carry them across the road, or they block traffic while these little guys are crossing the road. But essentially, this is very much a barrier to utilizing the ecosystems that these organisms require. And so in some places, in addition to building green corridors, there are also these little animal bridges that go across the roads, right? So, these guys can walk across the bridge, right? It is forested, it is protected. They're not going to get hit by cars here. And so this again connects to adjacent patches. All right, so take home message here is that the edge of the environment, the edge of the patch, is a um, very important spot that has very high biodiversity, but to support maximum biodiversity, you also need this interior space. So within the boundaries, the buffer between habitats. In order to promote both edge and interior spaces, it is ideal to protect land that is adjacent to each other, and if there is some kind of barrier like a road, to create connectivity as much as possible with things like land bridges or green corridors. And with that, my friends, we have completed our content for ecology. Thank you so much for being such great listeners and really thinking about this content over the semester. It has been my pleasure working with you guys. Thanks.